In accordance with Standing Order 43, the time for members' statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister acknowledge that he had two fundamental jobs this year: to get the COVID vaccine rollout right and to create a safe national quarantine system? And this week he has been shown to have failed at both.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I have had two very important jobs, Mr Speaker, from the day this COVID pandemic first hit this country in January of 2020. To save lives, Mr Speaker, and to save livelihoods. And, Mr Speaker, that is what our government has been working to do, Mr Speaker, in concert with all state and territory governments around this country, and most importantly, Mr Speaker, with the people of Australia. The people of Australia, whether it's frontline health workers or those keeping Australians employed in their businesses, Mr Speaker, those working in community organisations all around the country, those manning the phone lines, supporting people with their mental health, wherever they may be, Mr Speaker, Australians, Mr Speaker, Australians have been doing their job, Mr Speaker, and we have been doing our job to support them each and every day. Whether it was the Job Seeker and JobKeeper initiatives, Mr Speaker, the more than $20 billion in health support that we've put in place in concert also with the states and territories who've added that amount, Mr Speaker, each and every single day. Australians have been working together. This government has been working, our government has been working together with the state and territory governments, Mr Speaker, to ensure that Australia is in a position, even despite the very significant challenges that we now face in Victoria. And in Victoria, Mr Speaker, as I've just remarked outside of this chamber, they will go through a difficult period over these next 7 days, Mr Speaker. But we have faced these challenges in the face of COVID before, Mr Speaker, and we will overcome them again. But the way we will do that is by working together, staying focused on the problem, Mr Speaker, and solving that problem together and ensuring that we open up Victoria as soon as possible.
Just before I call the next question, I again reiterate everything I said yesterday, so members aren't surprised if they interject, they'll be ejected. I heard one interjection after I asked the member for Gellibrand to leave, saying that took 2 minutes. Can I tell you there's no time limit on which I'll wait to eject someone? It's very simple. The standing orders are very clear. They're outlined in the book you all have, and in fact you all voted for them. So I'm just making it very clear indeed. The member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please inform the House how the Morrison government's ongoing response to the COVID-19 pandemic will continue to protect lives and livelihoods, especially in my home state of Victoria?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Higgins for her question. I thank her and the many members of this chamber, Mr Speaker, who have shown such strong support to their communities over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. But given the member's medical background and experience, I've greatly appreciated her counsel and advice over these many months and 18 months, in fact, Mr Speaker, over the course of this crisis. Now, Mr Speaker, once again we are faced with another challenge in combating this virus. It's not the first challenge that we've faced, and it won't be the last, Mr Speaker. But this is a challenge here now in Victoria that we will face together with the state government of Victoria, and I commend them on their efforts to date, Mr Speaker, in addressing this latest challenge. A challenge and a battle, but we have overcome these many times. There are no certainties in the fight against the global pandemic, whether here in Australia or anywhere else. There are no guarantees. Our best defence is the steadfast resilience of the Australian people working together to put in place the protections that have been so enabling to Australians to come through to this point in the virus. And, Mr Speaker, that is what will sustain us all into the future, continuing on in that cooperative, Mr Speaker, in that collaborative, in that supportive way all around the country. The next 7 days will be important. They'll be difficult for Victorians, as the member for Higgins and the many members from Victoria in this chamber know. They will be difficult, but in my discussions with the Acting Premier this morning, as of yesterday, Mr Speaker, as well, we are determined together to ensure that we provide every support and assistance to assist Victorians through this next difficult period. And it's important nationally as well. It isn't just relevant in Victoria, it's important nationally. And I know that all Australians will be supporting Victoria in each way they can to ensure that they overcome this latest challenge, as other states and other communities around Australia have combated these challenges in the past before and equally overcome them. I particularly want to thank the many contact tracers working as part of the Victorian Government's effort right now, Mr Speaker. This latest outbreak is a very complex one with its many points, Mr Speaker, and I especially want to thank the 40,411 Victorians who came forward for testing yesterday. I want to thank the 30,426 Victorians who came forward and were vaccinated yesterday, Mr Speaker. And I want to continue to encourage all Australians, whether you're in Victoria or in any other part of the country, Mr Speaker. The vaccines are there with the GPs, Mr Speaker. They're there in the state clinics that have been established for that purpose. And the events in Victoria will remind, I think, all Australians that despite the fact that we've been able to live in this country in a way that virtually no other country, Mr Speaker, around the world is able to live like we are in this country at the moment. It comes with its challenges, as Singapore and many other countries, and even Taiwan, Mr Speaker, have realised in recent times. But I would encourage all Australians to get vaccinated and take up that opportunity.
Concluded. And I call the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister aware there are 237 aged care facilities in my state where residents have not been fully vaccinated, and 29 facilities where residents have not even received their first dose? This morning the Aged Care Minister said he was, and I quote, very comfortable with the vaccine rollout. How can the government be comfortable with older Australians being left so vulnerable?
The Prime Minister has the call.
It's the Minister for Health and Aged Care to add to my answer, but the figures that the member referred to in his question, Mr Speaker, are not current, and I'll allow the Minister for Aged Care and Health to update you on those figures, Mr Speaker. But what I do know is this. In Victoria today, more than 50% of those aged over 70, Mr Speaker, have been vaccinated. Over 50% of Victorians, Mr Speaker, aged over 70 have been vaccinated, Mr Speaker, had that dose. And Mr Speaker, that is important. That is an important difference as we go into this challenge and what we've faced in previous challenges. And Mr Speaker, I'll ask the Minister to update the House on the status of vaccinations in those aged care facilities.
Member for Ballarat, the Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And to add to the Prime Minister's answer, around Australia, approximately 97% of aged care facilities have been vaccinated so far. That means 4,322 visits to aged care facilities around the country. In particular, that is across age and disability care, 337,227 vaccinations. And very specifically within the Victorian context, there are 598 residential aged care facilities in Victoria. 582 of those have received at least their first dose. 7 are to receive their first dose today, and the remaining 9 tomorrow. And that would bring that residential aged care facilities within our home state of Victoria to 100.
Member for Franklin.
What that does is it provides a very important measure of protection to the most vulnerable. That is why we have prioritised them and why we have made sure that teams from around the country have been going in to aged care facilities in every state and territory. In particular, within the Whittlesea local government area, there are 16 residential aged care facilities, all of which have not only been vaccinated but have been vaccinated twice. And so these are important protections. And I want to thank all of those who have been vaccinating, and all of those in particular who have been facilitating that. And in addition to that, as the Prime Minister has said, we now have over 50% of Australians over the age of 18 who have had an initial vaccination, and over the age of 70 that have been vaccinated. So over 50% of Australians over the age of 70 that have been vaccinated. These are important and significant developments.
Order. The member for Nichols.
Thank you very much, Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how the Morrison-McCormack government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic is protecting jobs and driving growth in regional Australia, particularly in my electorate of Nichols?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
The member for Nichols absolutely understands, because he lives in regional Victoria, lives in regional Australia, how the measures that the Liberal and Nationals government have put in place are benefiting not just our country areas but indeed all of Australia, and none more so than during this time of a global pandemic. And indeed, we look at the assistance measures and it's a long list. JobKeeper. How many businesses did that keep with the doors open, people engaged with their employer? The local roads and community infrastructure, each and every one of the 537 councils across the nation benefiting from that program. $3 billion of additional funding for road safety measures. The Building Better Regions Fund. It's gone up to $250 million in the recent budget. $250 million.
Member for Macarthur.
But indeed, in the round 5 that will be considered very, very shortly, half of that, $100 million, is going to tourism. So hard hit by the COVID pandemic. The National Water Grid Fund, $3.5 billion, supporting farmers, supporting agriculture in the member for Nichols electorate. And I know how hard the Minister for Agriculture is fighting and making sure that agriculture can realise its potential as we work towards $100 billion by 2030. The sector-wide assistance that we have provided aviation, indeed $4.5 billion worth, but the Tourism Aviation Network support, making sure that we get those planes and tourists into those hard-hit areas. Home Builder, and I know how much of a difference that has made in regional Australia. Home Builder, making sure that we get tradies on the tools building the homes that we need. The instant asset write-off, making sure that those farmers, those small businesses can buy that ute, that trailer, that header, that cedar. That's being so well received, particularly in regional Australia, but in small businesses right across this nation. And indeed, as I talk about the local roads and community infrastructure, 5 councils, Campaspe, Greater Shepparton, Moira, Strathbogie and Mitchell, they have shared in $41 million of support in the member for Nichols electorate. These grants can be used by councils to upgrade roads, to build that local community infrastructure, which is so important. Tax cuts, 59,500 people in Nichols are benefiting from the tax cuts that this government is putting in place. That makes such a difference. Regional people having more of the money that they earn to spend on the things they want. And indeed, the Chukamoama Bridge, what a construction that is. And we're getting on with building that sort of construction, that sort of infrastructure as part of our pipeline, part of our $110 million
Deputy Prime
pipeline
Minister's
supporting
time
100,000 jobs.
has concluded. The Deputy Manager of Opposition Business.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister keeps describing Australians who've only received a first dose of a COVID-19 vaccine as vaccinated. Given the Prime Minister knows full well that these vaccines require 2 doses, why does he continue to use such misleading language about such a serious public health issue?
Members on my left. No, the Prime Minister will pause. A question's been asked. It is ridiculous that people behind the questioner start yelling out what the answer should be. I'm not going to warn anyone again. I'm now issuing a general warning. Your behaviour is appalling. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As the member would know, whether on a first dose or the completion of 2 doses, Mr Speaker, one of the great attractions of the AstraZeneca vaccine, as the medical evidence provides, Mr Speaker, is the significant level of protection against serious disease that is afforded by that first dose, Mr Speaker. So to suggest that someone who has only received a first dose, Mr Speaker, is not afforded any protection from that vaccine, that would be misleading, Mr Speaker. That would be misleading. And the suggestion by the member, by putting that, I think has been misleading by putting it in that way, Mr Speaker. But I'll ask the Minister for Health to add further.
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I am respectfully but deeply concerned by the implications of the Shadow Minister that implies that a first dose does not provide significant protection, significant and fundamental protection. And that is the case around the world. As members may know, one of the fundamental decisions which the United Kingdom made was in fact to stretch out the second doses in order to ensure that as many people as possible received a first dose at the earliest possible time. They settled on a 12-week difference between first and second doses on the basis that the medical advice is that that would provide the maximum protection to the maximum number of people at the earliest possible time. This, in fact, has been a global strategy, but it was reaffirmed in the advice of the Therapeutic Goods Administration and their decision to recommend a 12-week differential, which serves two purposes. It is deemed to be the optimal period of time, at which the doses should be given, but it also serves the purpose of ensuring that as many people as early as possible are vaccinated with the AstraZeneca vaccine. I understand that on many occasions the opposition has done their best to assist the vaccine rollout, but this particular question, I have to say, must be a source of deep disappointment to many, because it is implying that there is inadequate protection, it is implying that a first vaccine does not work, and it is implying that a dosing strategy based on medical advice is not the appropriate thing to do. So there are many things that the opposition has done to assist, but this is not one of those moments of which they should be proud.
Just before I call the members on my left and right, just before I call the member for Melbourne, I'd like to advise members we have present in the gallery, Cheryl Curnow, former senator and former member of this House. Welcome back. The member for Melbourne.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. In my electorate of Melbourne, shoulders are slumped and hearts are heavy as we face yet another lockdown. But we're angry too. You said you'd put the National Cabinet on war footing. So why isn't there strong national quarantine, which may have stopped the latest outbreak? And the US has managed to fully vaccinate 50% of its adult population, so why can't you even break 5%? This is a Morrison government lockdown in Victoria.
Will resume his seat. The Deputy Prime Minister is warned, as is the Minister for Veterans Affairs. The member for Melbourne will begin his question again.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. In my electorate of Melbourne, shoulders are slumped and hearts are heavy as we face yet another lockdown. But we're angry too. You said you put the National Cabinet on war footing. So why isn't there strong national quarantine, which may have stopped the latest outbreak? And the US has managed to fully vaccinate 50% of its adult population, so why can't you even break 5%? This is a Morrison government lockdown in Victoria. In Victoria, we've already done more than our fair share to stop a third wave, so why haven't you done yours?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thank the member for his question, and to all of his constituents, Mr Speaker, I will again repeat what I've said earlier today. These next 7 days will be very difficult for his constituents, Mr Speaker, but I have no doubt that in the same way that Victorians have faced previous challenges, just like this one, as people in New South Wales have, in Queensland and Western Australia even quite recently, Mr Speaker, the same processes that work to protect people on those occasions will work also here, I'm confident. The contact tracers that are working admirably in Victoria right now are working to track this down, and this circuit-breaking lockdown up to the next 7 days will provide them with further opportunity to be able to identify those who need to be isolated, and so Victoria can soon reopen again. Mr Speaker, it is true that the Commonwealth has put $500 million into the National Resilience Facility in the Northern Territory, and that is a direct result of the recommendation put forward by the Holton Review to the National Cabinet. It is true that the National Cabinet arrangements that were put in place to support hotel quarantine, Mr Speaker, which I note is a measure that is used in other jurisdictions, including New Zealand, and I can report that here in Australia, hotel quarantine has been even more effective there than in the New Zealand situation. And that has been a very effective way when you consider that over 300,000 people have come through the hotel quarantine system in Australia, and there are around 20 cases where we've seen breaches. But why we've been able to do as well across the states and territories, Mr Speaker, is the additional measures that have been taken. That is the additional measures being taken through the contact traces, through the isolation, through the testing, Mr Speaker, that enables these brief lockdowns to be in place and then be lifted, and to ensure that Australia can go on with living in a way with this virus, Mr Speaker, that few countries in the world can. Now, Mr Speaker, it is my job to continue to focus on working with the states and territories, to focus on those who are most affected, and they are your constituents and the many constituents of Victorian members here in this parliament. It is not my job to be distracted, Mr Speaker, by those who might seek to engage in some other process. I will simply stay focused on the job of working with Australians, working with the Premiers, Mr Speaker, to continue to keep Australians safe, to protect lives and livelihoods, as we have done over the past 18 months.
The member for Bennelong.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer outline to the House how the Morrison government's support to households and businesses through lower taxes is supporting Australians through the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bennelong for his question and acknowledge his experience in many fields before coming to this place, and including being an Australian tennis great, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, now the member for Bennelong understands that the budget is about creating more jobs, lowering taxes and guaranteeing essential services. It's a budget that was put together in the midst of the pandemic, Mr Speaker, and today my fellow Victorians got some very difficult news about another lockdown, and our thoughts and our prayers are with all Victorian families and indeed businesses at this time as they go through a very difficult and challenging 7 days. Now, Mr Speaker, in this budget we put in place policies to drive down taxes, including extending the low and the middle income tax offset to provide tax relief to more than 10 million Australians. So if you're earning $60,000, if you're a tradie, you're a teacher, you're a truck driver, then you will be more than $6,400 better off at the end of next financial year compared to before our tax plan rolled out. We also put in place the immediate expensing provision, which will support up to $320 billion of investment. And today, Mr Speaker, we got new ABS data for the March quarter, which showed that capital expenditure is up by more than 6%, the biggest increase in a quarter for 9 years, Mr Speaker. And manufacturing investment had the biggest jump in 16 years, Mr Speaker. And we also yesterday got construction data for the March quarter, which showed that construction for new homes was up by more than 10%, the biggest increase in 20 years, Mr Speaker. This is the product of our policies. And we also put in place in the budget a new policy with a patent box for the medical and biotech industry. And I had the opportunity to join with the member for Bennelong in his electorate at a great Australian company, Cochlear, who are going to use the patent box to commercialise research and development undertaken in Australia and registered in a patent, Mr Speaker. That business, like so many others, are developing cutting-edge, world-leading technology which is saving lives and improving the lives of our fellow Australians. On this side of the House, Mr Speaker, we stand for lower taxes, and the budget does exactly that.
The member for MACNAMARA.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Jewish aged care facility residents in Windsor, in my electorate, were meant to get their first dose of the COVID vaccine on 11th of May, but their appointment was cancelled at the last minute. They've still not received their first dose. Prime Minister, aged care is your responsibility. The vaccine rollout is your responsibility. Why are residents in this facility, in my electorate, being left vulnerable?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Just seek clarification. What was the name of the city you referred to? Jewish...
No, we can ask the questioner if you can stand up and...
It's the Jewish aged care facility in Windsor.
Thank the member for MACNAMARA. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the minister... seeking to answer the member's question, Mr Speaker. He's asked a very specific question about the Jewish care residential homes in Windsor. Dose 1 is scheduled, Mr Speaker, I understand from the schedule I have here, for the 28th of May. I'm sorry, the 28th of May, Mr Speaker. This is one of those facilities that the Minister was referring to earlier. That is tomorrow, Mr Speaker, and there is a small number of centres, Mr Speaker, that remain to receive their first dose, and the Jewish Care Residential Home Centre in Windsor, Mr Speaker, will be given their first dose tomorrow.
Members on both sides. Right, the member for Shortland and the member for Franklin can leave. Member for Goldstein has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Will the Minister please outline to the House how the Morrison government is continuing to support states and territories during the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Goldstein. And right throughout the pandemic, he's focused on the needs of his community, and we visited one of the early general practices together, which began the COVID-19 vaccination program. Across the country, we know that Australia is achieving results which, compared with the rest of the world, are extraordinary, but always we seek to achieve stronger and better results. This year there have been 94 days with 0 cases, but right now, my fellow Victorians, it's a difficult day for them. It's a difficult, challenging day, as it has been in the past. But we'll get through this. But having said that, the support is real and significant and tangible. The Commonwealth has invested $25 billion in supporting the states and territories and the Australian public through COVID-19 with health measures. In particular, over $2 billion for supporting our aged care facilities, both in terms of workforce retention, in terms of support with PPE, in terms of in-reach for vaccination. The second thing that has happened, of course, is that the primary healthcare network has been supported with over $6 billion of investment. A very significant part of that is that we now have well over 57 million telehealth consultations. Telehealth has been a fundamental part of our defence of individuals to give them access to medicines where the circumstances did not allow them to leave their homes, also to protect our GPs and our health professionals. This will be an important defence for Victorians in coming days, for those who wish to stay at home, for those who do not feel that they can safely venture to the doctor or their circumstances do not allow it. In addition to that, we also have the more than $7 billion invested in medical research and the vaccine program, a program which has now reached 3.9 million vaccinations around the country. And that program is absolutely fundamental. And then that is ultimately backed by the $9 billion which has been invested in our hospital and our PPE. The PPE, or the personal protective equipment, masks, gloves, gowns, whilst much of the rest of the world has had catastrophic shortages, we ran an air bridge. We've continued to make sure that Australians are supplied. We've continued to ensure that whether it's aged care facilities or whether it's the states and territories, that those supplies are available. They have been fundamental in keeping Australians safe. The budget invested and increased the funds available. All up, Australians are in a strong position, but we are working to keep them safe every day.
Has concluded. I call the member for Jagga Jagga.
Yeah. Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. There are aged care residents in my electorate who have not even received their first dose of COVID vaccine. And aged care workers in my electorate have been told to go and find their own vaccinations. Why are aged care residents and workers being left vulnerable?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I'll deal with both the general, but I understand the member made some specific comments about a particular facility today, the Iris Grange Heidelberg Heights facility, if I'm correct. Iris Grange is a facility which is a private supported residential service. The Victorian government had accepted responsibility for vaccinating that particular supported residential service in Victoria, and the date which had been advised to us was of 11 July. The Commonwealth is stepping in to vaccinate that facility, and Iris Grange is not a Commonwealth regulated or funded residential aged care facility. But despite that fact, and despite that it was listed on the Victorian Register, we are stepping in to do that. More generally, if I move beyond that, beyond Iris Grange, where again, as I say, it was a facility which Victoria had acknowledged and accepted was one that they were going to vaccinate, we will take that. In Victoria, 582 facilities done prior to today, another 7 today, and the final 9 tomorrow. I believe the Prime Minister was able to refer to one in particular from the member for MACNAMARA's electorate. And what this means is that we've been vaccinating Australians around the country, but in particular we have been focusing as our highest priority on our aged care residents. 337,227 vaccinations in aged and disability care. The InReach program, which has now covered 4,322 aged care facility visits and 97% nationwide. And then very specifically in relation to aged care workers, where vaccines are available and additional for those that are present at the time of an InReach vaccination, they are being vaccinated. But as with every other Australian, where there is the capacity for them to visit their GP, to visit a Commonwealth clinic or to visit a state clinic, they are being encouraged to do so at the fastest possible rate, at the fastest possible time. That is actually the fastest way to do this, and that is something using our general practice network, using our state and Commonwealth network. At this point in time, total Commonwealth vaccinations 2.522 million, total state vaccinations 1.38 million, all those systems working together, and to be able to have InReach and to be able to have the capacity of those workers who may not be there on a particular day or for whom there were not additional vaccines, to be able to visit state clinics, general practice, respiratory clinics or general practices means that there's a comprehensive approach.
The Minister's time has concluded. I call the member for Menzies.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is also to the Minister for Health and Aged Care, and I ask him to expand on his previous answers to update the House on the support that the Morrison government has provided to aged care residents and providers throughout the COVID-19 pandemic.
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Menzies and acknowledge that I believe tomorrow is the 3-decade anniversary of his being sworn into this House, which is an extraordinary achievement. In particular, as we look and look at the work that's being done to protect our oldest and most vulnerable Australians, with the focus being on the aged care rollout around the country and the fact that that is nearing completion, it is important, I think, that we outline the actions that have been taken to protect older Australians. And I would note that the Commonwealth Chief Medical Officer has advised me that he will be announcing that following the meeting of the medical expert panel, he will be declaring Greater Melbourne as a hotspot area for purposes of Commonwealth support, and that in particular includes single worker support for all aged care and residential facilities within that hotspot area. More broadly, during the course of the pandemic, we have provided $204 million for supporting aged care preparedness, for surge workforce, which has been fundamental in those facilities where they have faced challenges, because when a staff member has been exposed in the community, as was in particular the case during the Victorian second wave, often multiple staff members are then not able to work due to contact tracing and therefore self-isolation requirements. $442 million has been made available for the aged care continuity of workforce program. So these are workforce retention payments. Around the world in other places we've seen many staff who did not feel that circumstances were safe and therefore they were not able to be retained in parts of Europe, in parts of North America. At the earliest possible time, we realised the importance of supporting our aged care workers, and the workforce retention payment was a way of both recognising and supporting those workers, and they have done an extraordinary job, and we owe those aged care workers and the nurses and everybody involved a deep debt of national gratitude. Over $200 million to support the COVID-19 response for the Commonwealth Home Support Program, and $93 million for aged care workers in COVID-19 grants for additional actions within the region. In particular, when we also look at what's occurred, $57 million additional support for aged care under the National Partnership on COVID-19 response, and $35 million, very importantly, for expanding mental health support for aged care residents. So that mental health support is a fundamental element of supporting both residents and workers. We thank all of the workers and we provide our support to the residents.
Has concluded. The member for MCEWEN.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Last week, the Disability Royal Commission heard that 99% of residents in disability care facilities have not been fully vaccinated. How many residents in disability care in my state have not been fully vaccinated?
Yeah.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, in answer to an earlier question this week, we updated the House on the overall numbers of those in residential facilities who are getting disability care, Mr Speaker. We updated those figures, and from memory it was around 8,400 doses that had been administered, and that was significantly higher than the previously reported figure, which was just around about 1,000. And that is because there are many residents in disability residential settings who are accessing the vaccine through measures other than the InReach program. I'm happy to come back to the member with a more detailed number on the situation in Victoria, Mr Speaker, because that is something the Department of Social Services, and particularly Service Australia, is working with the providers, both of those residential facilities, and dealing directly to ensure that we can get a more accurate assessment of the number of those individuals who've been able to access vaccinations in other settings, Mr Speaker. This is a high priority, particularly for the Minister for the NDIS, working with those providers and operators to ensure the InReach services that have been so effective, as the Minister has just been outlining, into the aged care settings, where 97% of those facilities have been supported by those InReach services. And as that program now comes to a conclusion, Mr Speaker, those same InReach services can be used to support the InReach program into those residential settings for disability services. So there have been two populations, Mr Speaker, over the course of this pandemic, where our concerns at the start of the pandemic some 18 months ago were of a great concern. And they were, Mr Speaker, those Indigenous Australians, particularly in remote communities, as well as those Australians who live with disabilities. And over the course of this pandemic, Mr Speaker, the level of incidence of cases that we have seen, both for Indigenous Australians, in particular in remote settings, and Australians living with disability, Mr Speaker, has been very, very low. Very, very low, Mr Speaker. And I think that is a testimony to both the protections and support that have been put around, whether it be those Indigenous communities, and I particularly want to pay credit to Chief Minister Gunner in that respect, who we've worked closely with so many of those communities. I know he's worked closely with Minister Wyatt to that end, but also in the area of supporting people with disabilities, where the incidence of COVID in that group of Australians has been very low, particularly also, as I understand, Mr Speaker, by international standards. If the Minister wishes to add further, but I may have covered the matter off, and we'll come back specifically on the issues he's raised.
The member for Mallee.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Regional Health, Regional Communications and Local Government. Will the Minister update the House on the measures the Morrison-McCormack government has taken to safeguard the lives and livelihoods of rural, regional and remote Australians throughout the pandemic?
The Minister for Regional Health, Communications and Local Government.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Mallee for a question. And I might say at the start of the pandemic there was great concern around regional and rural and remote Australia about what the impacts of COVID might be, and the Prime Minister just alluded to that in his last answer, particularly in remote regional and Aboriginal communities. But I've got to say that the regional Australia stepped up admirably, and with the assistance of programs put in by the Commonwealth with respiratory clinics across the country, the telehealth has been a huge boom for delivering health services to regional Australia. The deal with the Royal Flying Doctor Service on retrieval, I'm looking forward to catching up with them tomorrow again to look at how the Flying Doctor might help us in the next phase of this program. And so, as a result, Mr Speaker, there's probably no other place on the planet that's been a safer place to be in the last 18 months than regional Australia. And so the member asked about not only with livelihoods as well. And so what was discovered was that people can work from regional Australia and keep their jobs. And many people were supported with JobKeeper and JobSeeker, but many people chose to work from home. And Mr Speaker, I worked on a Sky Muster satellite connection as a minister in this government for 10 weeks. All my phone calls, all my Zoom meetings go through the Sky Muster satellite. And we had children being educated, sent home from boarding school right across the country on the connections we have. But we have recognised that this is the way of the future, and through the Regional Connectivity Program, the last two rounds, $153 million, delivering high-capacity broadband right across regional Australia. And last week I was in Richmond in northern Queensland, where those communities right up through there in the member for Kennedy's electorate are going to be covered by high-capacity broadband. And so the other thing that we did as a government through the pandemic is we went to the sector that this government has a very close relationship with, and that's local government. We understand that we needed to put stimulus in right from the start, and local government have stepped up through 3 rounds of the local roads and community infrastructure program, delivering in the first instance jobs to people who had found themselves in difficult circumstances because of COVID, but ultimately leaving those communities with infrastructure that are going to help sustain and grow and leave a long-term legacy for those communities. And so I'd like to pay tribute to the local government sectors right across this country that have stepped up and supported their communities. There's one more step to go, Mr Speaker, and that is the vaccine program. And regional Australians are stepping up admirably. I've been to Aboriginal medical services, I've been to respiratory clinics, I've been to GPs right across this country, and they're saying that the Aboriginal communities and the people of regional Australia understand that they are still vulnerable to this COVID, and they are stepping up and they are taking the vaccine. They're protecting themselves, their community and their country.
The Minister's time has concluded. I call the member for Lawler.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Health Minister. Yesterday I asked how many of the Victorians infected in the latest COVID-19 outbreak had been vaccinated. The Minister undertook to seek that information. So I ask again, how many of the Victorians infected in the latest COVID-19 outbreak had been vaccinated?
Good question.
The Minister for Health has the call.
I'm not aware that any person who has been infected has been vaccinated. And I think that that's a non-controversial statement. And what I'm noticing here is there are 2 implications which are coming through today. The first is that the opposition is indicating that in some way, shape or form, if the Commonwealth were operating the quarantine system, the result would be different. We think all of the states and territories have been doing an excellent job.
I just say to the Minister, he's making some observations and understand he wants to do that, but he can't do that when he wasn't asked that question. He was asked a very specific question. I do say to the member for Lawler, the Minister can come back either at the dispatch box or by way of written answer, but it was a very specific question, and you said you believe you answered it in your first sentence. Well, in that case, that's the end of the matter.
And then was then adding...
No, that's the end of the matter. No, that's the end of the matter. We've just told me you answered it in the first sentence. The member for Curtin.
My question is to the Minister for Defence.
Members on my left.
Will the Minister please update the House on the Defence Force's Operation COVID-19 Assist and advise how the Morrison government is working to keep Australians safe during the pandemic?
The Minister for Defence.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for her question. Like all Australians, I'm incredibly proud of the work that the Australian Defence Force has done right across the country, not only in relation to the fires and floods, to a cyclone, but most importantly their continued effort, Mr Speaker, in relation to the COVID-19 response. The work of the Australian Defence Force, where they have provided support to Australians, not just in Victoria, has been quite remarkable, and they should be commended. In many cases, they've spent a lot of time away from their family and friends, and they have held up the best in our Australian Defence Force, and we should be very proud of that, Mr Speaker. I also want to acknowledge the efforts of Commodore Eric Young, CSCRAN, for his work in the Vaccine Operations Centre, the work that he's done in leading the people within that centre, providing support, his specialist support in logistics and planning, the whole team that works with him. Defence vaccine delivery teams have delivered vaccines in 181 aged and disability care centres. In some cases, these are very, very difficult cases, particularly those with disabilities who have comorbidities, other health needs and issues, and anaphylactic reactions in some cases, and all of that needs to be taken into consideration by the health teams as they roll out that vaccination program. Mr Speaker, the Australian Defence Force has provided significant efforts in protecting the cyber security and providing advice and assistance in this regard to key entities involved in the vaccine supply chain through the Australian Cyber Security Centre. It's almost unbelievable to conceive that organised criminal groups and indeed state actors would seek to exploit health information, patient records of aged care facilities, of health facilities, of state health authorities that hold important and confidential and essential information. But that is the case, Mr Speaker, so the work of the Australian Defence Force is absolutely crucial, along with the staff of the Department of Home Affairs. Mr Speaker, Operation COVID-19 Assist has seen the ADF deliver significant support to the Victorian Government throughout the pandemic. Over the course of the pandemic, almost 4,000 ADF members have been deployed in Victoria as part of the operation. Amazing. And since the start of the pandemic, those personnel have undertaken tasks in Victoria, including planning and logistics support to the Victorian Government, manufacturing face masks, border control, quarantine compliance, clinical testing, community engagement, contact tracing, support to Ambulance Victoria, logistical and clinical support to the Aged Care Response Centre, and vaccination of aged care and disability residents. As I note, 218 personnel are deployed in Victoria as we speak, currently providing support in particular to the Victorian Police.
The Deputy Manager of Opposition Business.
Thank you again, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The infection which sparked Melbourne's latest outbreak was caused by aerosol spread of the virus in hotel quarantine in Adelaide, the latest in a series of outbreaks caused by poor ventilation in hotel quarantine. Given the Prime Minister's refusal to create a safe national quarantine system, why has the Prime Minister failed to implement strong national standards on ventilation to prevent these repeated outbreaks from hotel quarantine?
Members on my left, the Prime Minister has the call.
Well, I don't accept the assertions made by the member in posing that question, Mr Speaker. The matters involving the source of this latest infection, Mr Speaker, have been considered by the South Australian State Government, and I note that, Mr Speaker, they've just noted that their protocols were followed. Mr Speaker, I also note that the recommendations that were provided by the Halton Review to establish a national facility, Mr Speaker, were adopted by National Cabinet and in particular by the Commonwealth Government, and the facility at Howard Springs at the cost of some $500 million, which I'm advised, to pick up on a question that was asked yesterday, Mr Speaker, their capacity will be at 2,000. Their capacity will be at 2,000, Mr Speaker, this month. That capacity won't be realised for some time yet in terms of the number of people there. But that capacity, Mr Speaker, has been reached to go from 850 to 2,000, Mr Speaker. That was the recommendation of the review, international quarantine facilities around the country. The member will be aware that a number of weeks ago the Victorian Government put forward what I think is a very favourable proposal, Mr Speaker. And one of the important things about that proposal, Mr Speaker, is it does not it does not propose that hotel quarantine, Mr Speaker, be discontinued. It says, Mr Speaker, that this facility be put in place in addition to hotel quarantine facilities, Mr Speaker. And so we will continue to implement those recommendations, and we will continue to work, Mr Speaker, with the states and territories to support them with the work that they do and to undertake the work, indeed, that we're responsible for, Mr Speaker.
The member for Stirling.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government is driving our economic recovery and creating a stronger Australia by taking positive action to keep our borders secure and our communities safe?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question, and I thank him for his service to our nation. Mr Speaker, the safety of our families and our businesses are absolutely critical to Australia's continued economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's why our government has so strongly backed our national security agencies. So that includes the Australian Border Force, the Australian Federal Police, the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission, ASIO and AUSTRAC. And in the budget earlier this month, we provided record funding to those agencies, and that included an extra $1.3 billion for ASIO to significantly improve their capabilities not only now but well into the future. Now, Mr Speaker, the great men and women of those organisations work hard every single day to protect us from a range of evolving threats, from terrorism and cyber attack right the way through to child sexual exploitation and drug trafficking. Now, Mr Speaker, our government is making sure that our national security agencies have the resources and the legislative power to protect Australia's critical infrastructure, our businesses, our families and our way of life. Now, the recently publicised ransomware attack on the Colonial Pipeline in the United States is a significant example of the threat that cybercrime presents and the potential impact that those crimes have on the day-to-day lives of people when critical infrastructure is sabotaged. Now, Mr Speaker, it doesn't matter that in that case, in the Colonial Pipeline's case, the attackers were motivated by money, not by the politics or political issues that some cyber attacks clearly are. The effect on consumers and businesses was that there was a massive disruption, and in that particular case, it was fuel shortages, it was price hikes and it was panic buying. Now, Mr Speaker, while Australia has not experienced an attack of that scale and that impact, we are certainly not immune. And what this government is determined to do is to make sure that we are putting in place the infrastructure, the changes to legislation, the resources to our national security agencies to be able to deal with the increasing threat that is coming our way through cybercrime and through cyber attack. Now, we understand that continued vigilance is so important to our recovery and as we come through the COVID-19 pandemic to make sure that we are going to have a safe and secure Australia for generations to come.
The member for MACNAMARA.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Earlier in question time, Prime Minister, you said that Jewish Care would receive its first vaccination of the COVID vaccine tomorrow. My office has spoken to the CEO, who says it can't be tomorrow because they've only recently had their flu vaccine. Prime Minister, don't elderly Australians deserve better than this?
Members on my left. Members on my left. The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. That is the advice that is provided to me by the department, Mr Speaker, that is working with all of those facilities, and we have been working over these last few days. As the Health Minister noted, 582 of the 598 residential aged care facilities have received their first doses. A further 7 facilities will be completed today, and the remaining facilities will be completed.
Seat. The Manager of Opposition Business. Whoever it is behind the Manager of Opposition Business interjecting is about to be ejected. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
On direct relevance, while I respect the information the Prime Minister is providing is important information, it is not relevant to this, and this question goes exactly to whether the information we've been provided today in question time has been accurate or not.
The Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. Yes, it was a specific question, and the Prime Minister needs to address himself to the specifics of the question, not to any other element. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And prior to the member taking the point of order, my point I was seeking to make was 7 facilities of those remaining will be completed today. The remaining facilities, which refers to the one that the member has raised, our advice is that that is scheduled to be completed tomorrow, Mr. Speaker. So,
members on my left.
Mr. Speaker, I can't speak in every case, Mr. Speaker, to the level of engagement that has taken place. But, Mr. Speaker, that is our advice, and so we will take further inquiries after question time today, and happy to come back to the member and confirm these arrangements. But as the member would appreciate, Mr. Speaker, with the large number of facilities that we've been involved with through this program, that is the advice that I have from the Department of Health. And, Mr. Speaker, we will confirm that advice and be happy to report that back to the member. But I'll ask the Minister for Health and Aged Care if you'd like to add further.
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I am happy actually to be able to provide some additional advice. The Chief Medical Officer of Australia was specifically asked to address the question of any facilities which had had flu vaccination within the period of the 2 weeks and whether that should be a prevention for a further vaccination. His advice is that it should not be a prevention and that the issue raised by the member is not a barrier, is not a prevention to
Member for Sydney will leave under Standing Order
proceeding,
94A. The Minister will pause, and if you could just rewind a couple of sentences, I'd like to hear what you were saying. The Minister has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Not only is that our advice, but the very question raised by the member for MACNAMARA was one which we had discussed in relation to the practice which had been to allow a gap of 2 weeks between a flu vaccination and a subsequent vaccination. The Chief Medical Officer's advice today is that that is not a barrier and that is not a reason for a facility not to be scheduled. Therefore, the advice that we have and the expectation is that the vaccination process will proceed.
The member for Higgins will leave under Standing Order 94A, and so will the member for Bruce. The member for Boothby has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Women. Would the Minister please update the House on the Morrison government's commitment to improving the safety of all women and children in Australia?
The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the member for Boothby for her question? There is no excuse for family or domestic violence, and everybody has a role to play, including governments. The Morrison government is acting to make sure women are safe in their home, safe at work and safe in their communities. Between 2013 and up until this budget, we committed more than $1 billion to this effort, including the $150 million package last year, so important as we responded to changing needs throughout the pandemic. For example, we boosted support to 1800-RESPECT, the national family, domestic and sexual violence helpline, which responded to more than 200,000 contacts last year. Mr. Speaker, there's always more work to do, and in this budget, the Morrison government has committed $1.1 billion for women's safety. This represents a down payment on the next national plan to reduce violence against women and their children. And there are key measures, including more financial assistance for escaping domestic violence, $5,000 payments, a 2-year national partnership agreement for frontline services, $35 million in primary prevention, $26 million to target online abuse. And importantly, it includes $12.6 million to expand the Safe Places program and provide more crisis accommodation for those who are fleeing violence. From this funding, the Salvation Army, Southern Aboriginal Corporation and Goldfields Indigenous Housing Organisation projects will share in $9.6 million. Part of the funding will allow for 6 self-contained units to be built that will support an additional 166 women and children each year in Albany. And I know that the support given to the Goldfields has been well received, with Chair Diane Logan pointing out that many Aboriginal women fleeing violent situations are just not comfortable in mainstream women's shelters, and having Indigenous-specific housing is critical to those who are otherwise living rough on the fringes of goldfield communities. So local leaders like Diane and her mother Betty are doing amazing work in their communities, helping women escape violent situations and shifting community attitudes. Mr Speaker, with all of these measures, the Morrison government is demonstrating our resolve to address the scourge of domestic and family violence for every Australian woman, and I look forward to seeing this vital work continuing.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Back in March, the Prime Minister said the vaccine rollout was, and I quote, not a race. And just last week, the Prime Minister said he was not, quote, overly troubled about low vaccination rates. Does the Prime Minister regret these statements?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Throughout the course of this pandemic, we've taken proactive steps to ensure that Australian livelihoods and lives have been protected. And Australia has been able to succeed in these areas like so many other countries hasn't. But that does not mean that we are in any way immune to the challenges of COVID-19, as the recent outbreak to impact in Victoria has demonstrated, Mr Speaker. That's why we will always encourage Australians to take those vaccines, and to take them, Mr Speaker, by engaging with their local GP, to put in place that network of GPs all around the country who are doing around 2/3 of the vaccinations around Australia. And by the end of this week, Mr Speaker, we anticipate some 4 million doses of that vaccine will have been administered, despite the fact that we've had to deal with the challenges of the ATAGI advice, which has changed the nature of which the AstraZeneca vaccine could be used for those under the age of 50, Mr Speaker, and also because of the supply disruptions we saw earlier in the year. It is true, Mr Speaker, that we did not take the approach of emergency procedures to take through the approval process through the TGA, Mr Speaker. We did not go through that process of cutting any corners or taking any different process, because we wanted Australians to be assured that the approval processes for those vaccines went through the proper checks and balances, and indeed they did, Mr Speaker. And it was because of that caution we were able, through the processes of ATAGI and the TGA, to identify the issues of clotting that has arisen in other countries. And as a result, the advice was able to flow through in this country, and Australians have been in receipt of that advice and can be making their decisions in ensuring their health interests are respected and protected according to the decisions that they wish to make. So, Mr Speaker, whether it's the $7 billion we've invested in ensuring that these vaccines are available, not just now, Mr Speaker, and not just over the months ahead, but indeed the Moderna vaccines that have been accessed by the government for booster shots next year. Booster shots next year, Mr Speaker, because we know that this pandemic is raging. It's not going anywhere, Mr Speaker. There are no silver bullets. There are no guarantees. There are no certainties, Mr Speaker, that can be provided in the middle of a pandemic. Our response is to work with Australians. Our response is to support Australians, Mr Speaker. We will keep fighting the virus, Mr Speaker. What others are fighting is up to them. We will keep fighting the virus and fighting that virus with other Australians right around the country, working with state and territory governments. And, Mr Speaker, importantly, I want to note that there is 28 Commonwealth-funded respiratory clinics in Victoria that can be accessed now. Mr Speaker, I also want to remind people about the pandemic leave disaster payment, which is available to people in Victoria, where if they have to stay home for 14 days to be isolated because they're a close contact or they're undertaking testing, then they can access that payment. I think it's $18 million has been provided to them.
Call the member for Reid.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Employment, Workforce, Skills, Small and Family Business. Will the Minister please inform the House on how the Morrison government has supported Australians with financial assistance as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and how it continues to support them?
The Minister for Employment, Workplace, Skills, Small and Family Business.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for her question? Morrison government
has strongly supported Australians throughout the pandemic and through the recovery. We have and will continue to provide record assistance to pensioners, families and job seekers. I think the whole House appreciates the great challenges this has caused across our nation, and luckily we've been able to use our comprehensive welfare system to provide the emergency support to Australians who found themselves in very difficult circumstances. As part of the government's response, we've provided 4 economic support payments totalling $2,000 per recipient. Through these payments, we've supported 2.5 million aged pensioners and 750,000 family tax benefit recipients, in addition to much-needed support for those on a disability support pension, carers and, of course, our veterans. All up, through the social welfare system, we've provided a staggering $32 billion in emergency support payments. And I note, for the member of Reid alone, that's 8,377 individuals in your electorate alone who've received the coronavirus supplement, let alone the other support payments that have come through. We've also seen the largest increase in unemployment benefits since 1986, the cost of $9 billion. And we'll continue to drive the economic recovery from the pandemic, and we'll continue to see the number of people in receipt of income support from the government decline. It shows that the Morrison government's economic plan is working. As at last week, 21st of May, there were 1.132 million people in receipt of unemployment payments. That's 149,000 less than 8 weeks ago when JobKeeper came off. It's 515,000 less than the peak of 1.65 million we saw in May last year. And of course, there's 45,000 more Australians in work now than there was pre-COVID, the only industrialised nation on earth that's been able to achieve that. It's 900,000 higher than the trough of the labour market in May last year. So we'll continue to drive the economic recovery, we'll continue to focus on jobs and we'll continue to focus on skills. It's why in the budget we saw a combined $2.7 billion to get another 170,000 apprentices into work, and we've extended that through to March next year, so we pick up all of those school leavers. And for the member for Reid, that's 1,405
The Minister proceed.
1,405 apprentices in the member's electorate right now getting skilled, getting supported, because that member has stumped up for the boosting apprenticeship commencements. And we'll continue to work hard, another $1 billion with the states and territories on Job Trainer, another 40,000 young Australians in transition to work. The Morrison government's economic plan is working and we continue to follow through.
The Minister's time has concluded. The Deputy Manager of Opposition Business.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care, and I refers to his previous answer. Right up until today, GPs have been advising patients they require a 14-day gap between COVID and flu shots, and only this morning the Aged Care Minister cited that 14-day gap as a reason for the slow COVID vaccine rollout in aged care facilities. Minister, when did the Chief Medical Officer's advice change, and when was that change communicated to the medical profession?
The Minister for Health has the call.
No, thank you very much. I happen to have with me the Chief Medical Officer's letter. I will have a copy sent down to the chamber and I will table it. That has come about precisely because of the circumstances in Victoria, and it's advice, as we always do, where we respond to the circumstances of the day. I will, with the grace of the House, Mr Speaker, read the relevant parts of the letter from the Chief Medical Officer. Yes, it's a response to the Victorian outbreak and therefore the ability to ensure that everybody is vaccinated. Dear colleagues, administration of seasonal influenza and COVID-19 vaccines, thank you for your continued efforts to ensure our most vulnerable populations are protected. You may be aware that the co-administration of a seasonal influenza and COVID-19 vaccine on the same day is not routinely recommended. This advice, generated by our independent medical experts, ATAGI, was first developed on what was an absence of data on the safety and effectiveness of those vaccines being administered on the same day. I am writing today to advise that I have consulted with members of ATAGI and can assure you that, given the evolving COVID-19 epidemiological situation in Victoria, it is my strong recommendation that residents and staff in residential aged care settings be vaccinated as quickly as possible against COVID-19. In order to do this, it will mean that there is a shortened interval of time placed between the administrations of the seasonal influenza and COVID-19 vaccine. It is important to note that this will not have an impact on the effectiveness of the two vaccines, but rather ensure that our most vulnerable are protected at a time when COVID-19 is circulating more readily within the community. Thank you once again for your continued efforts to combat COVID-19. Professor Paul Kelly, Chief Medical Officer.
The member for Braddon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Veterans Affairs and the Minister for Defence Personnel. Minister, I refer to the Morrison government's budget commitment to build additional veterans' wellbeing centres in Tasmania and South East Queensland. Can the Minister update the House on how our budget is helping veterans and their families to access the services that they need in their own communities?
The Minister for Veterans Affairs.
Well, I do thank you, Mr Speaker. I also thank the member for Braddon, not only for his service to our nation in uniform, but also for the work he's been doing in his community in the northwest of Tasmania. I want to congratulate the member for Braddon on the work he's been doing to engage with veterans and their families through the Northwest Veterans Group. And I had the chance to visit with the member just 10 days ago. Now, I've got to say, Mr Speaker, I'm very impressed by the way they're working in partnership to outreach throughout the more remote parts of Tasmania to deliver services to veterans and their families. I also had the opportunity on that visit, Mr Speaker, to catch up with the member for Bass in Launceston and see the work that Launceston RSL is doing to support our veterans in their own communities. Now, Mr Speaker, the member for Braddon asked me about the 6 wellbeing centres which were announced as part of the 2019 election campaign, and I must say we are delivering on those right across the country. Just to update the House, in Perth, the Veteran Central, organised by West Australian RSL, opened in November last year, and I had the pleasure of visiting this facility just a month or so ago, providing a range of services, including health services, to our veterans in Western Australia. In Adelaide, the Veteran Wellbeing Centre opened in April within the site of the former Repat General Hospital. A member for Boothby was instrumental in delivering that service for her community. In Townsville, the Oasis Centre is in its final stages of completion, and I had the pleasure of joining the member for Herbert as we toured that facility only a few weeks ago. There's a number of interim facilities also underway in Nowra. I know it has the support of the local member in Darwin. There's a facility Mates for Mates is already working on there, and also in Wodonga, where the Victorian RSL is working in partnership with the community to deliver services in that region. And, Mr Speaker, these services are making a real difference already. They're helping to save lives in those communities. One veteran said of the Darwin service, "It's great to know Mates for Mates are here. I left the Navy 27 years ago and have really missed the camaraderie of the forces. I love that there are activities out there that I can go to and be around ex and current serving members again." In the most recent budget, the government announced, the Morrison-McCormack government announced a commitment to expand the network of wellbeing centres to include Tasmania and South East Queensland. And that federal budget announcement for South East Queensland and Tasmania is very important because, Mr Speaker, this is not about Canberra, it's not about bureaucrats dictating solutions to local communities or dictating solutions to our veterans. This is about working with local communities to seek local solutions. Each of these wellbeing centres or networks will respond to local needs and deliver services on the ground to those communities when and where they need it. What we want to do, Mr Speaker, is work in partnership with our communities to build on the excellent work they are already doing to support our veterans and their families. There are so many people every day out there saving lives, working with our veterans community, and we'd be very proud of the services they're delivering. So this is part of the ongoing commitment of the government to improve the health and wellbeing of our military families right across the nation. Mr Speaker, it is saving lives, it is making a difference, it's an excellent program.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.